Thank you very much. All right. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for showing up for an accessibility training. You got a special bonus point today for being one of those people. And, that means either you've been struggling with some accessibility issues or you are one of those people who are aware and want to try and do the right thing for accessibility. So that's awesome. And hopefully we can cover the bases of the basic process here, and I want to share a few tools with you, but I'm hoping you might have some third-party content you're curious about. So I'll take requests if you've got any content that you're considering adding to your course, or you just maybe you've added it already and you want to check it. um, don't be shy, no shame. And I'll share my screen here if I can get to the proper monitor with the presentation. I've got 3 monitors going with Zoom, so this is fun. Can you see my blue background slide?
We can.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. And let me make sure I've got everything on board because the chat window goes away and all that fun stuff too. So that's always fun. Okay, I think got everybody on board. So let's jump in. And actually, no, the chat window just disappeared. That is the joys of Zoom. Sometimes it's outsmarting me. All right, so don't be shy if you have questions. Shout them out if I don't catch them in the chat window, and let's get on with it. So testing third-party accessibility, the basic idea is you need to know, what you're measuring against essentially, and then be able to figure out what really matters in terms of the content. And very little exists, as a solitary piece of content. Most of the web content today comes surrounded by a bunch of other things that might not be important, for your course. So sometimes we can target the good stuff and not have to deal with all of the wrapper and the navigation menus and all the fun stuff. So that's sometimes a possibility and the preferred capability if you've got it. But basically figuring out what you're trying to accomplish with this content that you want to bring into the course, as in, are you adding information in terms of facts, concepts, and principles, or are you trying to increase interest, boost engagement? Is it essentially redundant content, but it kind of sparkles and shines a little better? These are the considerations that will help you determine what exactly you need to be looking out for in terms of measuring the accessibility. Now, happily, the truth is out there, and it's really easy to see, the underlying code of most web content. And I'll be showing you how to get at that with your browser, and then I'll be showing you some tools that actually make that something you can stand to do. And you don't have to be a total nerd or know anything about HTML. You can still come into the background of the content and run some accessibility tests and just kind of figure out if you've got a problem or if there's some potential, right? And included with that is just a handful of basic keyboard techniques that you can just, really quickly and easily employ whenever you're working on your curriculum, or you find something that might be good to share with your course. You can just kind of kick the tires and see if it's going to roll or not. And then, finally, sometimes you've got content and it might have some accessibility issues, but maybe they're not deal breakers, right? Maybe there's something we could do about that. So before you give up hope and abandon, something cool that might help students learn, let's talk about how we can potentially save the good stuff. So that's the plan. Now, this is our roadmap. If you've got other questions or other things related to this, but not, like stated on this agenda, let me know, because the most important thing is that you get your questions taken care of. I'm hoping that when you go back to your desk, You're going to know more, be more comfortable, have a new skill set perhaps in terms of dealing with accessibility. So let's make the most of this time so that that is the outcome, right? Excellent. So measuring accessibility, we don't need to go crazy on this. I believe you've already got everything you need in terms of district support, and this is not new territory. But in a nutshell, you need to have the legal bases covered, which would be Section 508. You've probably heard that referred to. That is from the US federal government, and it's really good for technology standards. And it's incorporated into our California state law. So there's no getting out of it, whether you believe in the feds or the state, they both apply. And beyond that are the usability standards of the WCAG, the WCAG, which is the World Wide Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And they take the 508, technology standards and then inject a dose of user capability and usability conceptions for, how to approach anything on the web, essentially. So it's from the people who define HTML and the World Wide Web technologies that make everything work. So it's the ultimate source on how to do things. Again, I'm trying to save you the pain of getting, into your nerd zone. We've distilled it into some, hopefully easy to understand and easy to employ concepts and procedures. And then finally, as I referenced, you guys have been working on accessibility for a long time, San Diego, and make sure you're following all of the rules and the processes that have been created and put in place. It's nice to have that support and that guidance, right? So jumping in, the main point here is that whatever standard you've got, the individual student who comes and interacts with your content is going to be the final test, okay? True accessibility requires that ultimate usability test. If it's not usable, it doesn't matter what the technology checklist says. It's not usable, it's not effective, it's a fail, right? So we need to make sure that all of the great education we're putting out there can actually, be absorbed and used and interacted with by our students. So 508 WCAG, and then some common sense usability. I'm not expecting y'all to become accessibility specialists, but I do recognize you have a team of accessibility specialists in your midst, and I like to encourage collaboration and cooperation. So if you feel the need to go deeper, I encourage you to take someone from DSPS out and buy them a sandwich, right? And have a talk, see if they can help you with your content, perhaps. It'll be fun for both of you, right? Now, seriously, there's a lot of assistive technologies and a lot of different user cases that are way beyond any mere mortal's capabilities. So the other point here is to recognize you don't have to go crazy. You can't solve everything yourself. What I'm going to show you today is kind of the reasonable set of expectations for you to be able to parse out the good from the bad and the ugly, okay? There's a whole other layer of expertise where you should just employ, somebody with the experience and those credentials. And that's a cool thing about our system. We've got a really nice establishment for our DSPS programs. Now, getting into the foundational concepts of digital access. Whatever you're dealing with, you're going to need to be able to figure out if there is a very simple access strategy. There's a right way and a wrong way to do everything. And this is the, simplest depiction of what you need to do to ensure accessibility for your digital content. You need to make sure you actually have digital text, not like a picture of text. So something you can select and copy to your clipboard and paste is a good, quick, and easy test. Now, that's the first step. Within your text, you also need to have structure through headings and list styles and paragraph styles. You need to write clearly and make sure that it's easy to see, a large font with good contrast. So those are all basic concepts of text accessibility. When you use images, you need to make sure there's a textual description. When you use audio, you make sure there's a textual transcript, a textual description, if you will. And video gets the same treatment. It gets captions, which are textual descriptions, right? Now, interactive content, there's another layer of concern because we need to be able to provide these interactive elements to the user. They need to be able to use them, like make them work, but they also need to know what their point is. If they can't see the screen, there needs to be some kind of information programmed into the code so that that little piece of interactive, content can be described by whatever technology your students are using. So if they're blind and they're using a screen reader, the screen reader can actually announce out loud, this is an input field for your email, right? And then the user knows to put in their email address and proceed through the rest of the content. Now, of course, nothing is simple in this world. Well, very little is as simple as it could be, but that's a cool thing with multimedia. We like the power to engage across multiple channels of, sensory capability and awareness. So we have a lot of complex combinations of all of these types of media, and it can be overwhelming, but just take a breath and step back and remember you're dealing with text, images, audio and video, and then things that you can interact with, form fields and all kinds of little widgets that, pick a date for the calendar, pick a color, any of these things where you're using the mouse to kind of drive around and do things. Those are interactive elements. And we're going to talk about how you can just figure out if any of that's a pass or a fail, okay? Now, before we get into the simple process, I promise you it's not going to be too tough. But there is a lot going on out in the World Wide Web, and we can't oversimplify it. I don't want you to be freaked out about it. I want you to have a certain level of confidence and comfort here. But there are a lot of things to keep in mind. Not every piece of content has all of that stuff that exists, but there are some things that you do need to pay attention to that are kind of special. So there's something called a modal, and it's just a fancy term for a window that kind of pops up, but it's not a pop-up, like it doesn't get its own browser window. It shows up inside your web page. So if you go to Twitter and then you start a new tweet, it opens up a little window for you to type your tweet into. That's a modal. These are one of the interactive elements of the web that are very common. And unfortunately, they're also pretty easy to get wrong. And for people who are using assistive technologies, when that little window pops up, sometimes their focus through their technology does not go into that little window. So they're trying to navigate the information, but they're still on the page behind that little window. So we have a bunch of concerns just to make sure that your users are able to actually interact fully with all of the content. And that's the first three bullets here about modals. You need to be able to close them with the escape key. Normally we can click outside of the area and the modal will go away, but the keyboard control is critical. If you're not using the mouse, you need to be able to close that. Now, when you activate the modal, it's important that the computer sends your focus into that window, so you're not trying to navigate the background, right? And that's the first two, okay? The modal dialog needs to assign the focus to the first interactive element. That's the first form input. So in the Twitter example, that's where you were typing your tweet, so that when you start typing, all the information you're putting in through the keyboard goes into that proper little window instead of someplace else. Now, the modal dialog trapping keyboard navigation, that's just kind of a geeky way of saying your focus gets diverted into the modal window instead of staying in the background, okay? So a lot of concern, just because this is such a common aspect with so many different web technologies, and there's just a lot of people who are doing it without really taking the time to make it accessible. So be aware. And that's one of the things you should look out for when you're kind of scanning your content. Make a mental note, or actual a physical note, about any time a modal window opens up, and just make sure to check that. Now, the other area of concern that is not always an issue, but sometimes it is a timeout. So, for a quiz, would be a common thing where there might be a limited amount of time, but there's a lot of different content out there where there could be a timeout aspect. And these can be problematic if you're using assistive technology and it's not always announced. It's not always something you can be aware of because it doesn't communicate to your assistive technology. The other issue is even if you're aware that the time is ticking down, there might not be an accessible button or connection for you to say, hey, continue. And those are the two concerns for any content that has a timing function. All right, now in general, forms are the technological kind of backbone that allows interactivity to happen. A lot of what we use on the web and we click on and interact with is really a form at the program level. And for all form interactive elements, there just needs to be a textual label that explains what it is. And when you get it wrong, it needs to, the browser needs to direct your focus to the actual issue, the interactive content that you made your error on, and let you fix it there. So if it asked for a date and you didn't supply a date, but then you hit submit and it gives you the error, you must provide this required data, that's usually displayed in red text and kind of obvious visibly. But if you're using a screen reader, that might not be announced to you. Your focus might not be directed to that error message, and then you might not have any idea of where in the form you made the mistake. So that's a sophisticated bit of testing to do, to test the form and the functionality to make sure that that is the case. And that's where if you've got some content that has a lot of forms and you're not sure about this, it would be fair game to ask for help from DSPS and get some support. So recognizing that threshold of, where do you need to say, hey, that's enough, I need a little assistance here. That's part of this, okay? And that's why this is beyond basic. Now, the next bullet is about the video player controls. Everybody knows, or you should know, that videos need to be captioned to be accessible, but we often forget that the player, the little window that the video shows up in, that needs to be accessible too. We need to be able to get the play and the pause button and the volume. And if there's a slider, they'll let you jump to 2/3 through. All of that needs to be accessible through the keyboard. All right. And that's, you're going to know how to test that by the time we're done today. But that's something that's not always, obvious. And just remember to check that. And then finally, dynamic elements and information, things that pop up and happen while you're on a page, those need to be announced accessibly to a screen reader. And typically that's done through a technology called ARIA, which is not just an opera, piece where somebody's singing with a Viking hat or whatever. This is Accessible Rich Internet Application, an acronym, ARIA. And it's cool, it's often misdone, and it's also at that threshold where it's fair game to say, hey, I would like some assistance with this. If you want to go into that rabbit hole and explore all of that, it's not that difficult, but a lot of people don't, and no problem with that. No judgment, no shame. We all have a lot to do, right? So on that subject, let's talk about keeping it simple and manageable. Now, we talked about the standards to measure web content with, and remember, WCAG is about usability, but it's huge. It's one of the biggest documents I've ever seen, and I don't wish that on anybody to have to go deal with that. That's for accessibility specialists like me to suffer through. For all my faculty friends, I've been very fortunate and happy to be able to present these 4 simple concepts that you can more easily keep in mind and work with. It's POUR, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These concepts cover the entirety of what's in the WCAG. And when we break it down, you can see that it's really pretty common sense, but there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's easy to kind of take this for granted or to miss it if you're not paying attention. So let's just do a quick overview, and you'll see we're gonna be using these concepts as we do some samples and evaluations. Now, under perceivable, it is as obvious as you would think. It needs to be something you can perceive. Okay, so stuff you can see is great, but behind the scenes, that code can also be transferred into technology that makes it audible. So it can be read out loud. It can be converted into Braille, refreshable Braille display. So you can have touch or tactile representations. You can also use touch to interact if you're using a tablet, right? So there's an input capability as well as an output capability. Now, captions and transcripts. This is what makes audio and video perceivable to people who don't have the corresponding sensory capability, right? So if you're blind, you don't get to see the video, but you can have a transcript read out loud, or you can have the captions read out loud, or you can have a description. There's a narrative description that can be created and made available to make that video perceptible to you, okay? Text alternatives for non-textual content. That's kind of the catch-all for the descriptions. So anything that is made out of text can be communicated to other technologies pretty easily. If it's not made out of text, we need to provide a description that is made out of text. And that is what we can pass through to the screen readers or the different technologies used by people with different disabilities. Now, clear layout matters. So, just because it's accessible doesn't mean it's ugly, okay? It's important to maximize and enhance the visual presentation as much as possible. So engaging and colorful and clear and easy to see, that's all good, okay? And having a consistent layout style that leads to some cognitive consistency will help your students deal with information as well. If you're always switching things up and getting totally creative, there is an impact on the ability to parse out the information. And there's always the risk that your technique of presentation is overshadowing the content. I always remember in high school, the Latin teacher showed up in a toga one day to talk about Roman culture, and all we could talk about was she was wearing a toga. We totally forgot about the content, right? So you want to make sure that the main point of what you're trying to accomplish is being accomplished and not overshadowed by the shiny web technology. Now, adaptable is part of that magic where the technology can send your content to other types of technology and it can be rendered in a need of your user. So if you're deaf or blind, or if you've got mobility impairments or learning disabilities, there's a range of different technologies you can use to interact with web-based content. And when you follow the basic standards, you don't have to know about any of that. Your content just kind of magically flows where it needs to go. So that's the cool thing about learning to create accessible content. And the same techniques you're using to create accessible content are the same basic concepts and techniques you're going to use to test and assess third-party content, okay? So that adaptable is a huge part of it that is really good news for everybody. Now, the intelligent use of color covers a lot of things, right? But basically, you have to have contrast between the background and the foreground. And you want to make sure you don't use color as the exclusive means of communicating information, right? This is some basic accessibility stuff, but that's why it's easy, right? And this is all part of being perceivable. Hopefully that makes sense, right? Color is a great thing to use. You can use color coding, but you also need to back it up with some non-color based communication. Text is a great way. Spell it out in text and then add color to make it pop and make it even more dynamic. And that's great, all right? And it's totally accessible if you do it right. And just use more is kind of the bottom line with all of this accessibility. The more description and the more ways that your content can be presented to the user, the more likely it is to be usable and accessible. And towards that end, the very last one is semantic structure. We talk about semantics a lot, but with HTML, the semantic structure is actually those little code, the pieces of information inside the brackets are defining semantic meaning. And that's where the headings and the paragraphs and the lists, those are all spelled out through those little tags. And then you can make it look however you want to with presentation style. So This is a problem when you're testing third-party content because they dress it up to make it look pretty. It might look like a heading, but you don't know if it really is a heading until you can get down to that core level of semantic structure. Okay, so luckily there's a lot of tools that just do that with a simple click. So all of these perceivable, concerns are quickly addressed, and they will be listed out for you to just recognize and address as necessary. All right, so that's perceivable from poor. Next, we have operable. All right, this means, essentially it needs to work, right? It's operable. Now, what we need to unpack, to interpret that is you need to be able to interact with something besides your mouse. Okay, the mouse is cool, but we also need to be able to use the keyboard. And if you're on a tablet, we want to be able to access it through our touch gestures. So multiple input methods, okay? And the keyboard will cover pretty much the gamut. If it's something you can interact with using your keyboard, that content is most likely accessible to all of the other interface methodologies. If it's a tablet or a mouse or a pen with a touch screen. So make sure it works with something besides the mouse. And then make sure that it's not just a technical accessibility issue. Sometimes content will be created and it will be deemed accessible because you can theoretically get into the data construct and extract the meaning. But I've seen a lot of examples where the techniques and the steps of getting into a quiz question, for example, those can be so convoluted and difficult that it adds an entire extra layer of difficulty to the assessment. So you're no longer just studying algebra. Now you're studying advanced keyboard interaction with inaccessible content on top of algebra, right? That's a problem. So we want to make sure that not only is it keyboard accessible, but there's no extra cognitive load. We don't want our students with disabilities to pay a higher price just because it's theoretically accessible. There's a whole discussion about equity down that road, but the main point is ease of use matters. This is one of the main things for usability. And it doesn't need to be construed as extra easy. It just needs to be as easy as everybody else, okay? Timeouts, remember we talked about time limits. This is under operable. If it times out before you finished filling out the form, it's not working, right? So make sure that those issues can be taken care of through the keyboard. And also if there's audio or video on a web page, make sure it doesn't start auto playing if you can. I mean, if you didn't create the content, you can't really control that very well, but recognize that as a potential issue and avoid it. And sometimes there will be some content you want on a page that has a little video ad or something that starts playing. It's a judgment call sometimes whether you're going to inflict that on your students, or maybe there's another way you could extract the content into a new context where that autoplay media doesn't happen. A little extra effort, but it's the kind of thing that makes your curriculum more valuable and more powerful. So again, a judgment call for you. And finally, if you have content that is interactive, it's really nice when there's an undo in case you accidentally submit something or you accidentally touched it and it did something when you didn't mean to. So look for that. Make sure that there's no critical errors where your student could just be the victim of a technology gotcha. And that's one of those things that might not be an obvious accessibility concern, but it really is an operable kind of thing. All right, now understandable. This is a fun one for education. We need it to make sense, right? Which shouldn't be too difficult, but it's funny how often we struggle to communicate clearly, right? But understandable, for accessibility, we're really talking about that equity and that ease of use, making sure that your textual description is as powerful as the interactive animation that explains the same concept, right? It might not seem like your preferred way of interacting with information, but that is the dance. You have to make sure there is no separate but equal. It's all redundant, essentially. And that way you can use the really cool way of interacting with people who have sight, or the really cool way of interacting with people who can hear information. And then everybody who doesn't have those capabilities, they're not missing out because you have a really cool textual description or a really bulletproof, presentation of the content where everything can be communicated and nobody feels left out, right? That's the core spirit and philosophy of usability and accessibility. So that's an important one, and this is a challenging one that you just have to give yourself permission to keep working on it. And as you refresh your content each semester, just be on the lookout for ways you can enhance the meaning and the ease of use of your pedagogy and your curriculum. Okay, meaningful, clear, thoughtful. This is all just good instructional content, right? Now, language, of course, your grammar, your punctuation, your technical capability is important, but you also need to make sure that it's marked up behind the scenes, that language is declared as English, and the meta tags of your web content. And when you're looking at third-party content, that is something you can test and find out. This matters because we have students who use different languages on their home computers. And if you have a student who speaks Arabic at home and their computer uses an Arabic version of Windows, it's going to read things from the wrong side as far as us English speaking people are concerned. And if your content doesn't specify the language, it's very likely his computer or her computer who's using Arabic will see no declaration of language and just assume it must be Arabic. And then all kinds of chaos, comes out. So this is one of those things about making sure your content is understandable that can be a surprise gotcha. And that's why those little meta tags matter for author and language and title. Fill those out. Those always help, even if it's not obvious at the moment. And then finally, understandable, consider your illustrations, your animations, your video, all the cool, interactive, engaging content. Don't be worried if it isn't perfectly accessible. As long as it's not the exclusive means of presenting content, then it's not hurting anybody. It just becomes supplemental. And this is the dance that you see with a lot of online courses. There's required content, and then there's extra content. And we all know that for a lot of students, if it's not required, they're not going to study it, right? So just keep that in mind with your instructional design hat, that all of the critical stuff needs to be required, but you can still stack the deck with some really cool, impressive, presentation of that same information, and just mark it as supplemental and have this understanding and have this, conversation with your students if you need to. But I don't want people to find a really great piece of content and then deny their students that capability because it has an accessibility flaw. There's a difference between drop dead deal breaker and tarnished and slightly clunky, right? So in that spectrum of accessibility, we want to map out what we can save and what we can work with, and recognize that the world is built out of shades of gray, and that's how accessibility works as well. And there's a lot to understand, understandable, but that's the core of what we're up to, right? Now, robust, there's not a lot to say about robust, even though I filled up a slide to try and make the point. Robust really talks about the standards and the proper coding of your content. So for third-party content, you can kind of test it and make sure that it works, but there's not a lot you can do about it if it's not functioning quite right, other than to try and recreate it maybe within Canvas. And then you've got an accessible container where you can extract those facts and concepts and principles and present them. As long as it's text-based, that's really easy. When it starts to be complex, animated, multimedia, then it's a different situation, okay? But the bottom line for robust is it needs to work across all the different technologies, okay? So if you're using a laptop or a tablet or a desktop, if you're working with a smartphone, a smart watch, there's cars with smart dashboards now. The future is getting weird, and it's going to be a little more interesting to see where people are interacting with our content. So the best way to do this is to just do an accessibility check. And I'm going to show you some tools now that will perform a check with a click of a button, and they'll tell you if there's a problem. Okay. The world has gotten so much better for all of us. We just have to remember to do that. And then when we have our accessibility check, you know, the assistive technology and all of the technology of tomorrow as well as yesterday should be able to handle the message you're putting out there. This is another area where making friends with people in DSPS would be a good idea, just, you know, because they're the experts who can help you. And, you know, more often than not, they can very quickly identify something that might be a problem for somebody using speech recognition, for instance, or a screen reader. Screen readers are always the big, bright, shiny, obvious assistive technology, but there's a whole lot of other ways we can interact with our content, and you might be surprised. Some of it you might want to bring into your classroom, actually. Now, let's talk about what you want to bring into your classroom, right? The essential content, the good stuff, okay? And unfortunately, there's so much other stuff out in the web that the first thing we need to do is figure out where is the good stuff, where does it start, and where does it stop? And that brings to mind an ongoing conversation about the container versus the content, okay? If we're working with a Microsoft Word document, that's our container, and everything we type or import into that is the content, right? With a web page, it can be the same kind of situation. But then let's talk about Canvas. We've got a web browser containing Canvas, which then contains your course content. So we've got 3 layers of containers, you know, and content, you know, and it depends. Are you interacting with container or content is always one of the questions. You know, if you're in the browser address bar, you're in the container. If you're in the Canvas menu structure, I would argue you're still in the container. But when you get into your actual content pages, when you get into the quizzes and all of that good stuff in your course that you created, right? There's some content, but even then you could inject another container into that, right? So just don't let it bother you. Just understand it and get used to dealing with that basic aspect. Which way is up? Am I in an interface or am I in, you know, the meat of the sandwich? And then the next thing to be aware of is we can get rid of a lot of that external container layer just by copying and pasting the good stuff, okay? Now, if it gets to be interactive, it gets a little more challenging, but if you're just trying to communicate, you know, some good old concepts, facts, and principles that are represented in text, there are some cool things that we can do. And then it won't matter if there's a bunch of videos that start playing automatically, or if there's a strobing advertisement that might cause a seizure, you know, the classic things you want to avoid. Interactive elements, pop-up screens, bad modals, you know, mouse-driven content. All of these things are not what you want to bring into your course. They're distractions and they add cognitive load, and they're quite often inaccessible and sometimes can actually cause harm to students, right? So be able to map out the good stuff, and then we'll apply our accessibility test to those little nuggets and extract what we can. Again, the mission here is to not have to throw away good stuff that is going to help people learn and master your content, right? So essential content. And here's the really simple, I'm promising you it's simple, right? Simple process to get this done, okay? When you first hit a piece of content out on the World Wide Web, or the Wild Wild West would be another good, you know, abbreviation, www, just do a quick scan from the top of the page to the bottom, look at the layout, look at the navigation structure, check out what kind of interactive content is there, okay? Just kind of start to map out, is this complex multimedia, or is this a simple page that's just communicating in text? Or is this a dynamic web construct that will take some input and then add more content and have an ongoing kind of growing, evolving presentation? There's a lot of different ways media can happen, and you just kind of map it out and figure out what are you dealing with, okay? And then you can apply the POUR concepts and just make sure things are perceivable, make sure they work and they're understandable, and that it works in more than one kind of computer context, right? Just simplify all of that nerdy accessibility stuff into some really simple things. And then open up your web browser and start using some tools like the Wave tool, the Web Developers Toolbar, or the Axe tool. And most people have heard of the Wave toolbar if you've been to an accessibility training. It's really pretty ubiquitous. We're gonna sample all of these. I'm gonna show you how to make your life easier with these tools. Um, they're free, they're easy to get, and they work in all the different browsers. So it's great if you're on a Mac or if you're in Windows, whatever you're using, these extensions or plugins are available to you, and they will make your life very simple in terms of just sorting out your problems versus the good stuff you want to keep working with, right? Now, remember, I've talked about this threshold of reasonable capability. As a faculty member, there's a certain point where you're going to hand off challenging situations to your accessibility friends who have the big guns and the time and the experience to sort out those more challenging questions. Just remember that is an option. And if you hit the wall, don't hurt yourself. Just mark it and then circle back with some friends. And a lot of things can be taken care of when you've got a good crew. And we've got some good crew here in California. All right, so the basic steps. Remember, the first thing is, what are you trying to accomplish? Why do you want to add this content? Is it a critical fact? Is it a great example? Is it a novel way of interacting with the information? Does it make it more engaging? These are the kinds of things that will kind of set the stage for what you've got to be aware of as you go down the path. In general, the more boring and simple the content, the easier it is to make it accessible. But that's not always the case. Sometimes there's some really cool, complex, and dynamic content that's totally accessible. So you don't want to just throw it out because it looks cool, all right? But remember the basic steps here. You do your quick scan, consider your layout, look for sidebars, look for menus, navigation structure or structures, and then find out where is it you want to send your students. Where is the focus point, the main point, okay? What is your main point? And then get a little more, scrutinizing with it. Get those details from the POUR analogy. Make sure that it's got good contrast, that there's captions if there's a video. Test the keyboard out and see if you can navigate through all of the interactive elements. Use your extensions and plugins and let them do the hard work for you, okay? And then at the end of that, if there's something you're not sure of, or it's above your skill level and your pay grade, as they say, make a list of those and circle back and see, if there is actually a way to make it work. And maybe it's not as bad or mysterious as it might seem with the first check, okay? So you do your layout, you look a little closer at the details just to make sure it's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And then you circle back for anything that's not, okay? Now, within the browser, it doesn't matter what browser you're using anymore, as long as it's one of the modern browsers like Firefox or Chrome, or even the latest Microsoft version, Safari from Mac, the Brave browser. They all provide this ability to look at your HTML code. And they also all provide the capability to use these plugins that will simplify your life, okay? Now, the basics, excuse me, I jumped a page. The basic HTML artifacts. If you have the stomach and the desire to go down that rabbit hole, here's 3 simple things that will have a huge impact on any web content. Make sure there's headings. That's going to be your H1, H2 inside your brackets, okay? There's going to be a closing bracket as well. So you see in the very first bullet, I've got a sample, H1 in brackets, and then this is a heading 1, and then you've got your bracket with your slash H1, okay? This is as nerdy and geeky as we're gonna get in this presentation. But now if you have the desire to take it to that level, make sure you've got headings, and that will go so far. The next one is alt. Look for the alt tag and make sure that there is a meaningful description. And I gave you an example here. You got your alt equals quotes, meaningful description here, end quotes, and then your end bracket. All right. That's always going to be inside an image tag, which is IMG. All right. And if you have an image tag and you see it has alt and then there's nothing inside the parentheses, that's okay. That's just an empty alt tag, which tells the computer technology, hey, this is excuse me, not description. This is background image. This is decorative. That was the word I was looking for. This is a decorative image that is not bearing any significant information. It's just here to make you feel good about stuff, right? So that's all cool and that's valid. That can be accessible. That's the way you do it. The next one, form labels. This is the big one for interaction, okay? Now, this is also where things get hairy and most people tune out. The HTML becomes just a wall of text that hurts your head, right? So don't worry about it if you don't want to. But if you want to, here's what you need to know, excuse me. The label, the word label is the actual tag, L-A-B-E-L. And then there's a little bit of syntax here, okay? So you're going to have a declaration of the actual form field. So if this is an email input form, okay, you would reference the input field in that part that says for equals, okay? So the green highlighted, the very first chunk label, that's your tag. And then the next little highlighted chunk in gray is where you reference the form input field, okay? And then you close your label tag and you put in the actual description of your label where the blue highlight is, okay? And then you close your label tag. All right, so again, this is as nerdy as we're gonna get, but that is the recipe. Anytime you're using an interactive form field, and if you have the desire, you can open any web content in the world through your browser and parse out these little fiddly bits and see what's going on. But it's really a horrible thing to do. And that's why we're going to love our browser extensions. Now, just to give you the full story here, these are the keyboard commands that allow you to get into that layer of truth, if you will. So Control U will allow you to see the source, so the HTML. And I just remember U is for ugly, because that's what it is when you show that code more often than not. All right. Cool for us that the world has continued to take this capability and evolve and expand it, all right? So now we've got the developers panel where we can see much more targeted and filtered kinds of information. So you can get to the developers panel with Shift Control I or the F12 if you've got it. And you can also right click and inspect anything. So this is how the browsers work for Chrome and Firefox, and it's the same keyboard commands more often than not, okay? Now for keyboard navigation, it's just a handful of keys. Use your tab key to move through interactive elements. If you use Shift and Tab, it'll go backwards the other direction. Everything kind of loops and you go from the beginning to the end and backwards with the Shift. Arrow keys allow you to move between your options. Spacebar will allow you to select an option like a radio button or a checkbox, and Enter activates whatever it is, if the form field or a widget, and Escape will back you out, okay? With these keyboard commands, you can work your way through any content on the web, and if it doesn't work with your keyboard command, that's a big red flag that there's a problem, okay? So it's really pretty simple once you've got your recipe, right? Okay, the plugins and extensions, I've got the ugly addresses here so you can check them out. If you just Google the name, you know, Google's magic, it'll find it for you. But I'm gonna break into demo mode here and just show you how all of this works. I'm gonna stop sharing PowerPoint and just share my main screen here. And you might see a flicker. And now you should see my Zoom window, and let me just jump into Firefox here and slide that over. Boom. All right, so maximize it. This is the Wave page, just because I wanted to make sure and showed you all the Wave tool and how you can get it. it actually installs a little graphic up here in the upper right-hand corner. You'll see it looks like a W. And if I click it, it's going to activate the wave. Well, supposedly it would activate the wave tool. It's just a little slow here. So it's firing up, and then I just turned it off because I was impatient. So let's see if it'll fire up again here. All right. So you have to give Zoom a chance to catch up and get the graphics out there. But hopefully you see this little panel appear on the left-hand side, and it says wave at the top. And then the next thing is styles off or on. And then it's got a series of tabs where you can interact with the content. And it's really pretty simple. The summary will give you a breakdown. If there are any errors, that's a thing to notice. Alerts are important too. Structural elements, not so much critical. It's just telling you what's going on. It might be good, it might be bad, right? If there's no errors, it's pretty safe that those elements are not going to be too bad, right? But this is just the way it breaks down the information. If you want to see the specifics, click on details, and it gives you an inventory of everything going on, right? So some of it's important in terms of there's a problem. Some of it's just informative. So if you wanted to see the structure of your page, the structural elements tells you a lot, and not necessarily an accessibility problem, okay? It's just really kind of cool that it gives you that information. It gives you reference information. If you click on any of these little icons, like this H1, it tells you about headings, right? Which is pretty cool. If you see this little icon over here, what's that about? You just click on it, and then it gives you the important information under reference. So this is how Wave works. It should take a lot of the pain and the mystery out of the whole process. And when you're done testing and looking at the accessibility stuff, you just click on the W, and well, when it's behaving right, it'll go away. There you go. Sometimes it's kind of crazy making. Click it a couple of times if it's stuttering, and depending on how much zoom you've got going on, it might behave better or worse. But that's the Wave tool, and it's free, and it's pretty easy and awesome. Okay, so you don't need to kill yourself. Remember, Control U for ugly, and you see all this fun stuff. And this isn't a really bad page, but the Wave tool makes it a lot easier to deal with, in my opinion. Okay, now the Web Developer Toolbar is another extension, and we're getting close to time, aren't we? So won't take too much here, but just a quick overview. You see this little gear in the upper right hand corner, the Web Developer Toolbar. When you click that, it opens up a series of menus. Now, if Wave wasn't enough, if you want to go deeper, then you can use the Web Developer Toolbar to come in, and let's say you wanted to look at forms. You can tell it to outline all the form fields without labels. And then if there were any problematic form fields, they would get a big red outline, okay? There are a variety of tools if you're building web content, but just for accessibility, this gives you the hooks to get in a little deeper. If you click on images and you want to see images without alternate text attributes, you can outline those, and it'll just make it obvious there is a problem, right? And there it is. If you want to see what it looks like without images, you can click on hide images. And then what are all these other things that look like images? That's another conversation. We can talk about that later, but this is the way it works. So one of the cool things is under information, you can say view document outline, and it actually opens up a simplified version of the page with all the headings. So you can see in a glance if there's an effective heading structure for your content, okay? I just love the Web Developer Toolbar. Again, it's the little gear set in the upper right-hand corner, and it's got a lot of fun stuff. Not all of it's about accessibility, but it's pretty cool if you want to get your web developer game going, okay? Now, the last one I want to show you is Axe, okay? And this is a free tool from a commercial entity. When you open the inspector for developers, the developer's pane, and you've installed Axe, it will actually run a test for you. You click on the Axe little tab at the bottom. So I opened the developer's console, and the bottom half of the page is taken over with the developer tools, and you've got all these different tabs, network, style editor, right, performance, and so on and so forth. There's even an accessibility tool, which is pretty cool in Firefox. But Axe is a specific one where you hit analyze, it will actually test the page and then give you an inventory of all the different problems. And of course, for its own page, it gives you, congratulations, there's no problem here, which makes sense. They're trying to sell their service. But if there were problems, they would give you a nice list here, and you could send them to a developer, say, if you wanted to work with somebody and say, here's the line of the code with a specific WCAG or 508 issue. And again, this is a free tool that's very easy to use once you've got it installed. Now, I know we're right at the hour mark. So at this point, if anybody has something they would like to have me play with and demonstrate these tools with, send me a link through the chat and I can do that. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of keep going real quick and show you the accessibility inspector from Mozilla. This is unique to the Firefox browser. And I've given you the page in the presentation deck under references. If you want to go deeper and understand more about how accessibility works with HTML and take advantage of this other free tool, this is a great resource. It is a ways beyond that threshold of reasonable for most faculty. So again, if you're teaching web design maybe, or if you're interested in learning about HTML, then that would be a good place to go over into that rabbit hole. Okay, so let me go into the chat window and see what we've got here. Okay, so catching up on questions. PDFs, that is a document that is a whole other training. It's third-party content, but I didn't include it here because it is unique and it has its own challenges. If we want to have that, we can talk about doing a different training because we could easily spend an hour just about PDFs, okay? And then the accessibility in Office 365 is another example. Life has gotten so much better, and use the accessibility checker would be my bottom message for all of the Office 365 stuff, okay? And in terms of the World Wide Web and how it all works out there, I really encourage you to just go out there and see what you can find. And if you've got a question about how it works, we can figure out, you know, whether it's going to be a problem or if it's something you can deal with and fix. We haven't even really talked a whole lot about the ability to take things into Canvas, but I want you to just kind of take that thought with you. And when you go into Canvas, recognize that you can copy and paste a lot of things from the web into a Canvas page, and you can stack the deck, and maybe if it's missing a description or if it's missing a certain element, you can add it and you can save a lot of content that way, okay? So that's a really powerful thing that we can do because we have that capability through Canvas. Now, let me get back into the presentation just to wrap it up with the last couple of slides here. And I will thank you all so much for sticking with me. Now, hopefully you're seeing the final screen here. You know, when you have third-party accessibility issues that you just can't solve yourself, you can copy and paste it in the Canvas if possible. You can also contact the publisher, and you can work with your DSPS department and see if there's a solution that can be achieved. And sometimes there is. I've been very happy in finding the surprises. Now, resources, it's all out there for free, and that's how it should be. If you've got the time, we can explain it deeper if you have the desire, but here you go. If you want to figure it out and go further, these links will take you far, okay? And there's so much more. Keep in touch. Let me know if you have other questions or concerns, and you know, I'll talk your ear off. So that's the price you pay. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you for your concern and your desire to make your content accessible. On behalf of all the students with disabilities, I thank you. And now I will stop sharing and shut up long enough for you to question in yourselves.
Thank you, Jayme. That was very enjoyable.
Excellent.
It certainly was. I learned a lot myself. I took note of all those tools. They're something to explore.
Well, now I'm looking for a chance to be able to use the word modal in something. And I just want to throw that out, just throw that out there, and I'm in conversation because, It's a
So
new
here's
word for
your
me.
geeky phrase. You want to make sure your modal has a keyboard trap. And there you
Okay.
go.
That's right. I'm gonna weave that into something. I can see it now.
Awesome. All right, Rochelle, I will send you the PowerPoint file so you can distribute that if that's useful for anybody. And then follow up with me afterwards and we can talk about what you liked or didn't and the future and all of the problems in the world, right?
That would be awesome. If you could send it to me and to Trenton, and then that would be terrific. And then we can make sure it gets to the right place so that it can be posted. And then maybe we'll follow up with some additional trainings.
Perfect. All right then. And with that, I will bid you all farewell. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you online.
Thanks so much, Jayme.
Take
We
care.
appreciate it. Have a good one.
Bye, Jayme. Thank you, Trenton.
Thanks, Rochelle.